There is an oil field hidden beneath the Gulf of America, buried inside a desert, real dunes, 600 feet tall. It lies 170 miles out from the nearest shoreline, under 7,000 feet of seawater and a mile of salt below that. On the surface above it, there is nothing in any direction but open water. And this is not a theory. A platform anchored over that desert has been pumping it since 2019 and hit oil again this past December. The Gulf now produces about 1.8 million barrels of crude a day, more than Qatar and Oman combined. So how does a desert end up 5 miles beneath an ocean, and how much of it is still down there? The rock has a name. Geologists call it the Norphlet. For most of the last century, almost nobody in the oil business thought it was worth anything. Start on shore, though, because the ordinary version of this scene is worth seeing properly. The sand at Gulf shores, Alabama is famously white, not beige, not gold, white like sugar, and cool enough to walk on barefoot in July. It squeaks underfoot. Kids dig holes they abandon in 10 minutes. Look south on a clear morning and there are small pale shapes out where the water changes color. They look like ships. They never move. They're production platforms, standing in shallow water off Mobile Bay, some of them there since the 1980s. Tourists photograph them by accident, in the background of vacation pictures, and assume they're pulling gas out of mud and seawater. They aren't. They're drilled into the dunes. The formation is named after Norphlet, Arkansas. Population, under 1,000. A few streets, a school, a water tower, sitting just outside El Dorado, in the corner of the state that went briefly insane in the 1920s when oil came in and boomtowns sprouted overnight. That's where geologists first put a name to the rock. A red, sandy layer they kept punching through on the way to somewhere else. And that's how the Norphlet was treated for the next 50 years. Something you drilled past. Red beds, tight sand, dead rock. They were wrong about that. The first crack in the consensus came in southwest Alabama around 1970, when a well found natural gas in the Norphlet below 15,000 feet. That should not have worked. The rule of thumb was simple and, until then, reliable. Bury sand deep enough and the pressure and heat weld it shut. The pore space collapses. Whatever was living in those gaps gets squeezed out or cooked off. Below about 15,000 feet, the industry expected dead rock, and the Norphlet was far deeper than that. But the dunes stayed open. The grains never fully cemented, because fluids from the salt below and hydrocarbons arriving early had effectively locked the sand in place before burial could crush it. 5 miles down, in rock hot enough to boil anything you poured on it, there were still open pores. So in 1979, the industry took the idea offshore, into Mobile Bay, in state waters, in full view of a coastline that made its living on tourism. The wells ran past 20,000 feet. The gas came up sour, laced with hydrogen sulfide, corrosive enough to eat ordinary steel and lethal in small concentrations. Every joint of pipe had to be special alloy. Every safety system doubled. They drilled it anyway. Those are the platforms the tourists photograph. But that was the shallow edge of the story. The received wisdom held that the Jurassic desert petered out somewhere near the coastline, and that past it, in deep water, there was nothing but salt. The received wisdom was about to lose again. To understand why, go back roughly 200 million years to a moment when there was no Gulf at all. Everything was one continent, Pangaea. What is now Louisiana pressed against what is now Yucatan, what is now Florida sat beside Northwest Africa. Then the crust began pulling apart and a low basin opened between the pieces. Seawater flooded in from the west. Then the connection closed. Under a hot Jurassic sun, that trapped sea evaporated, flooded again, evaporated again. What it left behind was salt, a floor of it, averaging something like 5,000 feet thick. A mile of salt laid down in a basin sitting below sea level with no ocean left in it. What remained was a sunken, blazing, wind-scoured desert. Something like the Danakil Depression in Ethiopia, only the size of a sea. Rivers dumped sand into it from the north, and the wind took over from there, building dunes that migrated across a salt plain, the tallest of them rising hundreds of feet. That's the Norphlet, a fossil sand sea 5 miles down, which explains the sand. It does not explain the oil, and it doesn't explain how something that enormous stayed hidden for 100 years. By 2001, One company had decided the desert kept going. Shell started taking deep water leases in the eastern Gulf, hunting a play that officially didn't exist, in water thousands of feet deep and rock-hot enough to cook the instruments. The early wells were brutal. One prospect came up dry. Another found traces of oil, and traces don't pay for a rig that costs several $100,000 a day. Years passed with nothing commercial to show for it, on a theory most of the industry had already declined to test. Then, in early 2010, a well in Mississippi Canyon Block 392 came back with roughly 530 feet of oil-soaked dune sand. They named it Appomattox. Two things had to be true for that well to work, and the second one is why nobody found it sooner. The first is what happened after the dunes stopped moving. Around 155 million years ago, the ocean came back for good, and it drowned the desert gently, draping the dunes in fine, dark, organic-rich mud that hardened into a formation called the Smackover. That detail is the entire play. The Smackover is source rock, buried and cooked over the following 100 million years. It's the layer that actually generates the oil. And it was laid down directly on top of a reservoir made of clean, porous, wine-sorted sand. Source rock on top, reservoir below, salt sealing the bottom. Nature built the plumbing and then hid it. Because salt does not stay where you put it. Bury a mile of salt under miles of younger sediment and it stops behaving like rock and starts behaving like something slow and plastic. It flows. Over tens of millions of years, it rose and spread sideways into sheets and canopies thousands of feet thick, until much of the eastern deepwater Gulf had a lid of salt lying over everything beneath it. And salt is very good at scattering sound. Seismic surveying works by bouncing sound off buried layers and reading the echoes. Fire sound at a salt canopy, and it refracts, distorts, and comes back as noise. For decades, every seismic image of the deep eastern Gulf turned to static below the salt. The dunes were never missing. They were unreadable. That changed in the 2000s with wide azimuth seismic, surveys shot from multiple directions at once, then reprocessed with enormous amounts of computing power until the blur under the salt resolved into shapes. And in the shapes, geologists started seeing something odd sitting at the top of the salt. Small, rounded forms. Dune crests. So here's where it stands as of 2026. The Appomattox platform is a 4-column semi-submersible moored in about 7,400 feet of water, some 80 miles off Louisiana, operated by Shell with a 79% stake alongside INEOS Energy. First oil came in May 2019 at a project cost roughly 40% below the original estimate. Peak output was pegged around 175,000 barrels of oil equivalent a day, and Shell has called it consistently one of its highest producing assets anywhere in its portfolio. It was built as a hub, and that's the part that matters. Rydberg came online in 2024. Dover, drilled to 29,000 feet, followed. Each new discovery gets piped back to the same platform instead of needing its own. And the drilling has not stopped. In December 2025, Shell and INEOS announced yet another Norphlet find. The Nashville, drilled more than 5 miles beneath the seabed into high-quality oil. As of now, they still haven't said how big it is. The evaluation is ongoing. A Jurassic desert, still handing over new fields, 96 years after the first person called that rock worthless. Now, the part that involves you specifically. In Texas, when oil comes out of the ground, somebody owns those mineral rights. A family, a trust, a company. Out here, nobody does. You do. Federal waters are public property. Every lease is bought at auction from the United States government, and the bids, rents, and royalties flow back to the Treasury, with a share going to Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama for coastal restoration, and a portion feeding the fund that has helped pay for public parks in all 50 states. The marsh grass being replanted in a Louisiana wetland. The boardwalk at a state park 2,000 miles inland. Some of it is paid for by a buried sand dune, and most of the people walking on it have never heard the word Norphlet. So what does could change everything actually mean here? Do the math, and it looks like it means nothing at all. Appomattox and Vicksburg together hold an estimated 650 million barrels. The United States burns through roughly 13.5 million barrels a day. At that rate, the whole field is about 7 weeks of supply, which sounds trivial. And that is exactly the wrong way to read it, because volume was never the point out here. duration is. A shale well in West Texas comes on hard and fades fast. A large share of everything it will ever produce comes out in the first year or two. To hold a shale field flat, you have to keep drilling new wells, forever. Stop, and the whole thing falls away behind you. A deepwater hub does the opposite. Appomattox took nearly a decade to find, appraise, and build, and it was designed to run for more than 30 years from a single structure. It's slow, enormously expensive, and once it's running, almost boringly steady. That's the trade. Shale gave America speed. The Gulf gives it a floor, the part of national production that doesn't move when the rig count does. Which brings us to the last number, and the one nobody can calculate. The dune field does not stop at Appomattox. The same Jurassic desert runs east, into water that is closed. In 2020, the eastern Gulf was withdrawn from oil and gas leasing through June 30th, 2032. Everything east of a boundary called the Military Mission Line, and everything within 125 miles of Florida. Not because the geology is poor, because of tourist beaches, and because the Air Force uses that water and airspace for weapons testing. Then, in November 2025, the federal government's draft leasing plan proposed 2 sales inside that closed area. One in 2029, one in 2030. Florida's own congressional delegation, Republicans included, wrote to the president asking him to keep it shut. That fight has not been settled. So how much oil is hidden beneath the Gulf has stopped being a question for geologists. Nobody is unable to find out anymore. Nobody is allowed to. Back at Gulf shores, the sand keeps squeaking underfoot. It's quartz, most of it, washed down from the Appalachians and sorted by water and wind until only the hardest, whitest grains were left. 5 miles below and 100 miles south, there are grains just like it. Sorted the same way, by the same wind, under a sky nobody was alive to see. The people who said the desert ended at the coastline weren't fools. They weren't incompetent. They simply could not see through the salt. That problem is solved. The machines can read the rock now, and the platforms out past the horizon are proof. What's left isn't a limit of instruments. Half that hidden desert lies underwater where the only thing standing between the drill bit and the dunes is a line somebody drew on a map. The dunes have waited 160 million years. The line can be redrawn in an afternoon. This channel is called Geoscope, and this is what we do here. Point the instrument at the thing everyone drove past. There's a lot more of it. Subscribe if you want to keep looking.